A few weeks ago, I was having drinks with a consultant who specializes in emerging markets. For years, he was the kind of person who preached that economic growth and free speech were inseparable. But that night, he seemed to have abandoned the script. He showed me a video on his phone of a glistening, ultra-modern metropolis where every public square was monitored and every digital post was harmonized. It's beautiful, isn't it, he asked. No friction, no protests, no misinformation tearing the social fabric apart. They've optimized society. I expected a punchline, but it never came. He wasn't being sarcastic. To him, the chaos of open debate had become a liability, a bug in the system of progress. When I mentioned that the United States used to be the guarantor against this kind of thinking, he just laughed. The Americans, he said, they've moved on. They've realized that values don't pay the bills. They're making deals now, not manifestos. That shift from viewing free speech as a universal right to seeing it as an optional, even dangerous luxury is the defining trend of our decade. We're witnessing a world that isn't just drifting away from liberal values, but actively sprinting toward a model where dissent is synonymous with disorder. As authoritarianism stops apologizing and starts selling stability as a product, the geopolitical map is fracturing. We are reaching a tipping point where Europe and Canada are no longer just members of a global consensus. They are becoming the last survivors of a shrinking philosophy. The world is walking away from free speech by design. And if the last open societies don't realize they are now minority, they may find that history doesn't remember who was polite. It remembers who was silent.
Wow. Yeah, that is a genuinely heavy thought to start us off.
Right. It really is. But, it perfectly sets up the mission for our deep dive today.
Right.
We are going to examine exactly how Europe and Canada are, actively navigating this massive global shift.
Right.
Because we really need to unpack the internal legal frameworks they use to protect expression, the diplomatic tightropes they have to walk, and honestly, the strategic necessity of forming a cohesive, values-based alliance to counter this rise of techno-authoritarianism.
Absolutely, because the immediate question for any liberal democracy right now is, how do you maintain societal order in the digital age without just adopting those exact same authoritarian controls?
Yeah.
Authoritarian regimes are selling stability, like your consultant friend said, but they do it through direct suppression. Democracies have to find a totally different mechanism.
Which brings me to this story I heard recently about a content moderator. Her name is Clara, based in Brussels. She literally spends her entire day navigating the labyrinth of the European Union's Digital Services Act.
Oh, the DSA. Yeah, that is a massive, massive piece of legislation.
Huge. So imagine Clara sitting in this glass-walled office, just staring at a screen filled with, borderline content. I mean, speech that is highly offensive to a lot of people, but is still technically legally protected under the EU's pretty stubborn commitment to fundamental rights.
Right, which is just so different from other parts of the world. I mean, Clara's position is unique because in an authoritarian system, her colleagues just have it so much easier.
Right, they just wipe it out.
A government official flags a post for, disrupting social harmony, and they just hit delete. The directive is absolute.
But Clara is bound by this framework that views open speech not as a risk to manage, but basically as the unavoidable price of a free society. I actually saw a post from someone in her exact position describing just immense pressure from security agents.
Sure, pressure to treat dissent as a direct threat to the state. Right.
But she actually chose to uphold a controversial post because it didn't cross that really high threshold of being outright illegal. And reading that, it made me think about my own channel and creating content.
Yeah, you feel the walls closing in sometimes.
With every new safety update, it feels risky. But there is something deeply grounding about the EU refusing to just surrender the principle of speech for the convenience of security. Letting the loud and angry have their say feels dangerous, but the second we start managing speech like a corporate asset, we have lost the soul of the platform.
That's a really great way to frame it. And that is exactly why the EU's legislative response to disinformation is built the way it is. They actively moved away from pure platform self-regulation to a co-regulatory approach. And the anchor, like you mentioned, is the Digital Services Act.
Right, the DSA. And that mainly targets the really big players. Right?
Yeah, the very large online platforms, or VLOPs. If you are using a major social media network or a massive video site, you are on a VLOP. They face strict binding rules now on transparency and risk assessment regarding illegal content. But the really brilliant part, and this is crucial, is that the EU intentionally avoids defining disinformation in the actual law.
Wait, they don't define it at all. That seems, I don't know, counterintuitive. Why wouldn't they just clearly outline what disinformation is?
Because if you write a strict legal definition of disinformation, that definition basically becomes a weapon. It creates a mechanism for state-sponsored censorship. Yeah, a ruling party could simply label any criticism of its policies as disinformation and just order it removed. So instead of dictating what is true or false, the DSA mandates transparency. It harmonizes the procedures platforms use to moderate content.
Okay, so it focuses on the process, not policing individual thoughts.
It forces these platforms to explain how their algorithms push content to your feed, ensuring they act objectively.
And doesn't that tie into the political advertising regulation too? Because that targets the specific mechanics of micro-targeting.
Perfectly.
Like when you see a political ad online, it has often been tailored specifically to your psychological profile, your location, your browsing history.
Exactly. So the regulation requires absolute transparency for these ads. Citizens must know exactly when they are viewing a political advertisement, who paid for it, and why they were targeted.
So you aren't just being secretly manipulated by some hidden financial interest.
Right. It is about protecting the formation of genuine political opinions. And this also connects directly to the European Media Freedom Act, the EMFA. Traditional media outlets have largely lost their role as the primary gatekeepers of information, right?
Yeah, the digital platforms hold all that power now.
Right. So the EMFA is designed to protect traditional media from arbitrary platform censorship. It grants them this sort of media privilege. Well, if a platform decides that a piece of investigative journalism violates its community guidelines, it cannot simply delete the article immediately. Under the EMFA, VLOPs are required to provide independent media with a 24-hour notice and a strict right to reply before restricting the content.
Wow. So they can't just silently ghost a newspaper article. It is almost like the European Union is building a complex set of zoning laws for the digital public square.
Zoning laws.
Yeah. The landlord, the tech platforms, they have to adhere to strict safety codes, algorithmic transparency, procedural fairness. But the government still refuses to dictate exactly what citizens are allowed to say while standing in that square.
That is a spot-on analogy. By relying on internal market legislation, the EU leverages its massive economic weight without the state managing the specific discourse.
But, while Europe relies on these massive regulatory frameworks internally, Canada faces a very different facet of the same crisis. Canada has to navigate the friction between its strong domestic legal protections and the harsh realities of international diplomacy.
Yeah, that friction is most visible when a nation committed to human rights engages economically with an authoritarian state.
Right. Like this account I was reading about a Canadian trade attaché named Julian. He was stationed in a capital where unity is enforced by the police and stability is basically the only authorized currency. His job was to secure a massive green energy contract. But right in the middle of his briefing notes, he gets interrupted by a report of a local blogger arrested for a single tweet.
Just one tweet? Man, that is the classic diplomatic nightmare right there.
An utter nightmare. Imagine the silence in that boardroom. The local officials are smiling, offering a pen for the contract, while Julian knows that a single public word of protest could vanish billions in investment.
Ew.
He chose quiet diplomacy. Just a whispered concern during a tea break rather than a loud condemnation, trying to balance Canada's identity as a human rights defender with the cold reality of economic survival. It is a tightrope walk where the wind is always blowing from the side of the authoritarian host.
That is a brutal position to be in.
When I saw this mentioned online, it hit me how lonely Canada's position can feel. We want our leaders to be moral heroes, but they are also responsible for the paychecks of the people back home. It makes you realize that defending free speech globally is a constant, agonizing negotiation.
And to understand Julian's compromise globally, you really have to unpack how Canada manages expression domestically. Under Section 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, expression is explicitly protected. But Section 1 contains what is called a reasonable limits clause.
Okay, so the right to free speech in Canada is an absolute.
No. The government is legally permitted to limit rights, provided those limits can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And the judicial mechanism used for this is known as the Oakes test.
The Oakes test? Is it just a checklist?
Yeah. It is a highly rigorous, multi-step evaluation. First, the government must prove there is a pressing and substantial objective for limiting speech.
Okay, so a real tangible reason.
Right. Second, there must be a rational connection.
Yeah.
The censorship must actually address the specific problem. Third, and this is perhaps the most important, there must be minimal impairment. The government has to prove to a judge that the restriction is the absolute least restrictive way to achieve the goal.
Interesting.
And finally, there must be overall proportionality between the harm of the speech and the harm of limiting the right. That is how Canada legally restricts categories like hate speech, obscenity, and defamatory libel.
Like the Keekstra case, right, where they restricted someone teaching Holocaust denial.
Exactly. The Supreme Court applied the Oakes test and deemed the restriction on hate speech a reasonable limit. Canada has also faced historical moments where emergency media censorship was enacted, like the FLQ crisis.
Right, in 1970, when the War Measures Act was invoked, CBC News reports were heavily restricted, journalists had to only broadcast attributed stories, and some were even jailed. If Canada's own legal framework uses the Oakes test to restrict speech for pressing objectives, like maintaining order during the FLQ crisis, how is that philosophically different from an authoritarian regime claiming it must restrict speech to maintain national stability?
The fundamental difference lies entirely in the architecture of accountability. In Canada, limits on speech must be prescribed by public law. They have to be debated, documented, and subject to rigorous, independent judicial review.
So it is transparent.
The burden of proof rests on the government to demonstrate in an open court that the restriction passes the Oakes test to prevent real, demonstrable harm. In an authoritarian system, censorship is arbitrary and opaque.
Right, a bureaucrat can just unplug a server or arrest a blogger because the ruling party feels threatened.
Exactly. There is no independent judge, no public test of minimal impairment. That process of public justification is the exact mechanism that separates a democratic limitation from autocratic suppression.
The process itself is the safeguard. But, having examined how Europe and Canada handle this internally and diplomatically, it becomes pretty clear that isolated domestic policies just aren't sufficient anymore.
They really aren't. We are operating in a world where authoritarian regimes are actively cooperating to export their model of digital control.
Which brings us to a frankly terrifying thought experiment. Try to imagine a dimly lit corner of a global summit in 2026, where a German diplomat and a Canadian minister are looking at a digital map of the world. And on this map, the countries where speech is truly free are shrinking like receding glaciers.
It is a grim picture, but very plausible given current trends.
So I saw a report suggesting that these two delegations were the only ones left in the room refusing to sign a global stability pact that would have standardized government backdoors into encrypted apps.
Meaning total state access to all private communications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
While the rest of the world's powers, including some traditional allies, were moving toward a model where power flows from the leader's whim, these two were desperately trying to draft a values-based alliance. They realized that if Europe and Canada don't sink their legal shields now, they're going to be picked off one by one.
Yeah, by a global network of censors who are already sharing their technology and tactics.
Right. Free speech is no longer the default setting for the world, but a fragile exception. This alliance narrative feels like a final stand. It forces these remaining democracies to stop bickering and start building a unified front for the sake of our right to disagree.
The strategic necessity of this unified front becomes so obvious when you look at the tech. These techno-autocracies are not just using brute force. They are utilizing AI, biometrics, and big data to surveil populations. Think of the Great Firewall, but upgraded.
So winning the tech race is essential for the physical survival of liberal values.
Absolutely. Authoritarian systems collaborate constantly. They sell surveillance technology to one another and normalize digital repression. To counter this, an alliance of liberal democracies requires systemic coordination among G7 members, the EU, and Canada. They have to engage in strategic decoupling.
You mean untangling their tech supply chains from authoritarian countries?
Exactly. It is called friend-shoring securing supply chains by moving manufacturing to allied nations. And they need to coordinate export controls on dual-use technologies to stop adversaries from acquiring advanced capabilities. Forums like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, serve as blueprints for this collaboration.
So basically, operating as isolated liberal democracies right now is like showing up to a relay race as a single runner. The authoritarian states are actively passing the baton, sharing tech, censorship tactics, economic leverage. Unless Europe, Canada, and remaining open societies form their own cohesive team, they will simply be outpaced by the sheer coordination of the opposition.
Right. A fractured democratic response is a failed response. Autocratic systems scale rapidly because they don't have to navigate public debate or independent courts. For democracies to maintain their edge, deep coordination on engineering standards and cross-border protections is the only viable countermeasure.
The geopolitical map is permanently fracturing between systems that view free speech as a liability and a shrinking minority that views it as an essential right.
Yeah.
Europe's regulatory shields and Canada's agonizing diplomatic balancing acts are the front lines. But ultimate survival requires a unified, values-based alliance. And I want to end on a stark realization regarding the hidden costs of censorship.
Yeah, the economic data is pretty undeniable on this.
According to an econometric analysis by the Montreal Economic Institute, greater freedom of expression directly fosters greater economic growth by stimulating innovation. The data indicates that Canadians would be $2,522 richer every single year if public policies encourage freedom of expression to the extent seen in countries like Norway.
That is an incredible figure. It really puts a concrete number on the value of open debate.
The transition away from free speech does not just cost a society its political soul. It imposes a literal, measurable financial penalty on every citizen living under it.